Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling chapters of American history. Today, we will plunge into the shadowy depths of the Appalachians, where an entire family disappeared without a single clue during the frigid winter of 1842. Please share where you are watching from, as it's important to understand that this mystery remains unsolved to this very day. It all began to unravel in Harlan County, Kentucky, in December. The Appalachian Mountains at that time were a realm of near-total seclusion. Families lived days of travel apart, separated by profound gorges, dense forests of oak and pine, and a persistent mist that seemed to consume every sound. That year, a biting cold arrived earlier than usual, and streams were starting to freeze at their edges. This was a place where the law scarcely reached, where sheriffs needed weeks to comb the valleys, and where family secrets were buried under layers of silence and age-old custom. The Callahan family resided on a remote homestead high on the slopes of the Pine Mountain region. There were 7 of them: the patriarch, Thomas Callahan, his wife Martha, and their 5 children, whose ages ranged from 4 to 16. Thomas was known as a quiet, reserved man who spoke little but labored tirelessly. He had built his cabin with his own hands years prior, using chestnut logs he himself had felled. The homestead was nearly a mile from the main trail connecting the area's scattered farms to the small settlement of Cumberland Gap. They were seldom seen, which was not unusual for that time and place. Appalachian families could go months without contact with neighbors, especially during the harsh winters when trails became impassable. Yet there was something distinct about the Callahans. Their closest neighbors, who lived 3 miles away, noted that the family appeared perpetually watchful of the shadows, constantly on edge, as if anticipating something dreadful emerging from the woods at any moment. The last verified contact with the family happened on November 23, 1842. Thomas had gone down to the village store to purchase essentials: flour, salt, lamp oil, and ammunition for his rifle. The store's proprietor, a man named Samuel Porter, recorded the sale in a ledger that survives in the county's historical archives. Samuel would later inform investigators that Thomas seemed anxious and restless, continually glancing over his shoulder as if pursued. When Samuel inquired if all was well, Thomas only muttered something about the coming winter before hurrying away. That was the final time anyone saw Thomas Callahan alive, or any member of his family. The initial weeks of December passed without event. As noted, losing track of isolated families during winter was common. However, as Christmas neared, a neighbor named Rebecca Mills grew concerned. She had promised Martha Callahan she would bring some homemade bread and preserves before the holidays, a tradition among the few women in the area to sustain human bonds amid the mountain solitude. Rebecca made the arduous trek to the Callahan homestead on December 26th. Heavy snow had fallen in the preceding days, blanketing the trails with an ankle-deep layer of white. The journey took her nearly 4 hours, and when she finally glimpsed the cabin through the trees, she felt an immediate wrongness in the air. No smoke rose from the chimney. No sounds of children playing or animals stirring came from the small barn beside the house. There was only an absolute silence, broken solely by the wind whistling through bare branches. Rebecca called out to the Callahans. No one answered. She approached the front door and knocked, first gently, then with more force. Nothing. The door was unlocked, which was peculiar. Appalachian families always secured their homes, especially at night. Rebecca slowly pushed the door open, and the creak of rusty hinges echoed through the vacant dwelling. The cabin was icy inside. The fireplace had been cold for days, perhaps weeks. Dishes remained on the table as if a meal had been abruptly abandoned. An iron pot still sat on the wood stove, holding the frozen remains of a stew. The beds were unmade, blankets thrown aside, as if people had risen in haste. Yet there were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture. No marks of violence on the wooden walls. Rebecca walked through every room. She found clothes in the closets, untouched personal items, even the family Bible lying open on a small table by the window, but no people. All 7 members of the Callahan family had simply vanished, as if plucked from existence in the dead of a winter night. Terrified, Rebecca ran home and told her husband of her discovery. He promptly gathered 3 other local men, and they returned to the Callahan property before nightfall. They searched the house again, the barn, the small chicken coop. The animals were also missing: 2 cows, a horse, several chickens. Simply gone. Yet there were no tracks in the snow, no footprints leading away from the homestead, no indication that anyone or anything had passed through recently. The news spread slowly through the mountains, moving from farm to farm and valley to valley. In early January 1843, the Harlan County Sheriff finally arrived to investigate. He brought 2 deputies and spent 3 days scouring the area. In the barn, they found something unsettling: strange marks on the hard-packed dirt floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. But these marks ended abruptly, without continuing outside. It was as if whatever had been dragged had simply vanished into thin air. Sheriff William Hadley was a seasoned man, a veteran of conflicts with outlaw bands in the mountains. In his 15 years of law enforcement in Kentucky, he had witnessed terrible things, but never anything like this. There were no bodies, no blood, not even a clear indication of foul play. Just an entire family evaporated, like morning mist in the Appalachian valleys. Hadley began questioning everyone who knew the Callahans, though there were very few. The family had moved to the area just 3 years earlier, from somewhere in eastern Virginia. No one knew the precise location. Thomas never spoke of his past, and Martha was even more withdrawn. The children were rarely seen, and when they did appear in the village, they seemed frightened, staring at the ground and clinging to their mother's skirts. A farmer named Ezekiel Thornton, who lived about 4 miles from the Callahan homestead, told the sheriff something disturbing. He recounted that about 2 weeks before the disappearance, while deer hunting in the mountains, he had heard screams coming from the direction of the Callahan farm. High-pitched, desperate screams that echoed through the trees. Ezekiel considered investigating, but the distance was great, and dusk was falling. He also admitted he was afraid, not of the Callahans, but of what might be occurring on that isolated property. The screams ceased after a few minutes, and Ezekiel returned home, trying to convince himself he had imagined it all. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Jacob Reeves, revealed that he had seen strange lights in the woods near the Callahan property on several nights in November. They were not ordinary lanterns or campfires, but pale, almost bluish lights that moved among the trees as if floating. Jacob was known as a sensible man, not prone to superstition, yet even he admitted these lights deeply unsettled him. He tried to follow them one night, but they always seemed farther away than they were, eventually disappearing completely. Sheriff Hadley documented everything in his official journal, now preserved in the Harlan County archives. He also discovered something critical while examining the store's records. In the weeks before his disappearance, Thomas Callahan had purchased an unusually large quantity of salt. Not just ordinary cooking salt, but entire bags of rock salt, the type used for preserving meat through long winters. Samuel Porter, the store owner, estimated Thomas had bought enough salt to preserve an entire steer, if not more. Yet there was no beef, no preserved meat in the house, nothing but that frozen stew in the pot and some moldy bread in the pantry. By mid-January, the sheriff expanded the search. He organized a group of 20 volunteers who scoured the woods around the Callahan homestead for a radius of nearly 15 miles. They searched for days, braving knee-deep snow and temperatures that plunged well below freezing at night. They found only trees, ice-covered rocks, and the oppressive silence of the mountains. Then, on the 5th day, a volunteer made a grim discovery. He stumbled upon a hidden ravine about 2 miles north of the Callahan property. At the bottom, partially concealed by snow and fallen branches, lay a torn and soiled scrap of fabric, a child's dress. Rebecca Mills identified it immediately. It belonged to the Callahan's youngest daughter, 4-year-old Sarah. The dress was stained, though not with blood, but with something dark and viscous that no one could identify. The sheriff carefully collected the garment and ordered a thorough search of the ravine. It took 2 days to clear the area of snow, leaves, and debris, but they found nothing more. No other clothing, no bodies, no further trace of the Callahans. Theories swirled through the community. Some believed the family had fled in the night, perhaps from fear of something or someone. Yet this did not explain why they would leave behind all their possessions, including the family Bible and Thomas's savings. $43 in gold coins found hidden in a coffee can in the kitchen, a substantial sum for the time. No family would flee without taking that. Others whispered of darker possibilities. The Appalachians have always been a place of ancient legends, stories passed down through generations about beings inhabiting the deep forests. Some older residents spoke of primordial land spirits, entities existing long before European settlers, who were said to occasionally take those who ventured too far or built homes in forbidden places. Sheriff Hadley did not believe in superstition, but even he conceded the case defied all logical explanation. He continued the investigation for weeks, traveling to neighboring towns, checking if anyone had seen a family of 7 traveling, consulting stagecoach records, and speaking with traders on the Appalachian roads. No one had seen the Callahans. In February, an even stranger event occurred. A fur trapper named Daniel McKinney, setting traps near a frozen creek about 6 miles from the Callahan homestead, found something bizarre. A book, waterlogged and partially frozen in the creek ice. After freeing it and drying it by a fire, he discovered it was a diary. Martha Callahan's diary. Daniel immediately took it to the sheriff. The pages were water-damaged, many words illegible, but readable fragments sent chills down the spines of all who saw them. Martha wrote of a fear that was constant and growing, consuming her day by day. She mentioned Thomas seeing things in the woods, things he refused to describe fully. She wrote of the children suffering terrible nightmares, waking screaming in the night, speaking of figures at the windows. In an entry from mid-November, Martha wrote something that made little sense. They want what we've hidden. Thomas says we must leave, but where? They'll find us anywhere. Who were they? What had the family hidden? The diary offered no clear answers, only disturbing fragments of a terrified family, living their final days in escalating panic. The last legible entry was dated November 21st, 2 days before Thomas's final store visit. Martha had scrawled just 5 words in shaky, desperate handwriting. They are knocking at the door. The diary's discovery transformed the investigation. Sheriff Hadley realized he was not dealing with a simple disappearance or planned flight. Something deeper and more sinister was at work. He decided to search the Callahan property again, specifically for anything the family might have concealed, anything valuable enough to draw dangerous attention. The search lasted 3 full days. Hadley and his men dismantled sections of the cabin, lifted floorboards, checked walls for hidden compartments, and dug around the foundation. On the 2nd day, they found something. Under a loose stone in the fireplace was a small hollow space containing old, yellowed documents wrapped in oilcloth. The documents were property deeds, not for the farm where the Callahans lived, but for land in eastern Virginia, near the North Carolina border. Dated 1823, They were in the name of a man named Jonathan Whitmore. Accompanying the deeds were old letters revealing a troubling story. Jonathan Whitmore had been a prosperous tobacco merchant in Virginia. The letter suggested he had acquired his land through dubious means, possibly by defrauding native families resisting colonial expansion. One letter, from a lawyer named Herbert Moss, warned Whitmore of threats he had received. People wanted their land back and would not accept money. The letter concluded with a grim warning. "You should consider leaving this region, Jonathan. There are forces here that our courts cannot control." But what connected Jonathan Whitmore to Thomas Callahan? Sheriff Hadley began investigating genealogies and family records. It took weeks, but he ultimately uncovered the truth. Thomas Callahan was actually Thomas Whitmore, Jonathan's grandson. He had changed his surname, apparently to escape something linked to his grandfather's past. This revelation opened the door to even more disturbing theories. Could descendants of the families defrauded by Jonathan Whitmore have been hunting Thomas? Could they have finally found him and his family hiding in the Kentucky mountains? Yet this did not explain the complete absence of physical evidence, the lack of bodies, or even the disappearance of the animals. The sheriff decided to travel to Virginia to investigate the lands mentioned in the deeds. It was a journey of nearly 200 miles, requiring days on horseback through difficult terrain. He set out in March 1843 with one of his deputies and copies of the documents. The region where Jonathan Whitmore's land lay was even more isolated than Harlan County. It was deep in the Appalachian foothills in an area called Devil's Fork, a narrow valley surrounded by steep mountains and forests so dense sunlight barely penetrated. The nearest settlement was a tiny place called Blackwater, with no more than 20 families. When Hadley arrived in Blackwater and began asking about Jonathan Whitmore, he was met with only silence. People literally refused to speak. Doors were slammed shut in his face, and conversations were abruptly cut short, as if the very name Whitmore was taboo, something not to be uttered aloud. Eventually, Hadley found an elderly man willing to talk. His name was Nathaniel Cross, and he was in his 80s. Nathaniel remembered Jonathan Whitmore well, and his expression darkened at the mention of the name. He led the sheriff away from the village to a secluded spot in the woods. Before speaking, Nathaniel explained that Jonathan Whitmore had indeed stolen land belonging to a family named Blackwood. The Blackwoods were no ordinary settlers. They were descendants of one of the first families to settle in the region long before most other communities were established. There was something different about them, something people avoided discussing openly. They practiced ancient rituals, maintaining traditions brought from across the ocean, blended with even older practices learned from the native peoples of the land. When Jonathan stole the Blackwood lands in 1823, the family did not seek legal recourse. They did something else entirely. Nathaniel would not elaborate, but he made it clear the Blackwoods had cursed Jonathan Whitmore and all his descendants. Jonathan died just 2 years later under mysterious circumstances. His body was found in the woods, though the exact details were never officially recorded. His son, Thomas's father, had vanished completely when Thomas was still a child. Hadley felt a chill. He did not believe in curses, but the story had a disturbing coherence. He asked Nathaniel if the Blackwoods still lived in the area. The old man shook his head slowly and pointed toward the deeper mountains to the east. They were still there. They always had been, and they always would be. The sheriff decided he needed to find the Blackwoods and confront them directly. Nathaniel refused to guide him, saying he had not been near that part of the forest in decades and had no intention of going now. But he gave vague directions. Follow the main stream up the valley for about 8 miles. Look for a trail marked with stacked rocks, and follow that trail to its end. Hadley and his deputy set out the next morning. The journey was more arduous than anticipated. The forest grew progressively denser, the terrain steeper. The stream they followed was frozen in places, forming ice formations like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. After hours of difficult walking, they found the piled stones. The trail leading from there was nearly invisible, covered in moss and flanked by ancient trees that seemed to loom over them. They continued for another 2 miles until the trail ended in a small clearing. In its center stood a cabin. Unlike typical Appalachian structures, it was made of dark stone with a low, lichen-covered roof. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was inside. Hadley called out, identifying himself as the sheriff. There was no answer. He called again, louder. The cabin door opened slowly, and a figure emerged, an elderly woman so aged her skin resembled parchment, stretched over bone. Her eyes were a pale, almost colorless gray, and when she looked at Hadley, he felt as if she could see right through him, reading every thought and secret. The woman said nothing, merely watched. Hadley explained why he was there, mentioning the Callahans, their disappearance, and the documents he had found. The woman listened without changing expression. When he finished, she finally spoke, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. She said only one thing: "The debt has been paid." Her words hung in the cold mountain air like a final judgment. Hadley tried to ask more questions, demanded explanations, even threatened legal action. But the woman simply retreated into the stone hut and closed the door. No matter how much he knocked or called, she did not respond, as if she had said all there was to say. The sheriff's deputy, a young man named Peter Hollis, was visibly shaken, begging to leave immediately. There was something profoundly wrong about the place, something that triggered every instinct to flee. Hadley, despite his skepticism, had to agree. The clearing seemed to drain the daylight, making everything darker than it should have been, even in mid-afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Hadley noticed disturbing markings around the cabin, circles etched into the frozen earth, unfamiliar symbols, and small bones hung on strings from the surrounding trees, swaying gently in the breeze. They did not appear to be human bones, but there were dozens, creating a soft, hypnotic, and deeply unsettling clinking sound. The return journey to Blackwater took less time, driven by an urgent desire to escape those dark mountains. By the time they reached the village, it was night, and Nathaniel Cross was waiting for them in the only tavern. The old man took one look at them and knew where they had been. He asked no questions, simply poured strong whiskey and advised them to leave at dawn. That night, in the small Blackwater Inn, Hadley could barely sleep. He kept thinking of the woman and her words. The debt has been paid. What exactly did that mean? Had the Callahans been killed as restitution for crimes committed by Thomas's grandfather decades ago? If so, where were the bodies? Why was there no physical evidence of violence? In the morning, before leaving, Hadley had a final conversation with Nathaniel. The old man was more willing to talk, perhaps knowing the sheriff would soon be gone forever. Nathaniel recounted old stories about the Blackwoods, passed down through generations in the mountains. He said the family possessed knowledge dating back to ancient times, before the United States existed, before the first settlers arrived, knowledge of how to bend reality, how to move between this world and other places existing in the shadows, in the spaces between what is seen and what is ignored. Nathaniel explained that when the Blackwoods marked someone, they marked the entire lineage. It was not mere revenge, it was something deeper, more fundamental about restoring balance, mending a wound in the natural order. And when the time came to collect what was owed, nothing in this world could stop it. Hadley left Virginia with more questions than answers. During the long ride back to Kentucky, he tried to organize his thoughts, to craft an official report that made sense. But how could he explain his discoveries? How could he write in an official county document that a family had possibly vanished due to a curse cast 20 years prior, he would be ridiculed, possibly removed from office. Upon returning to Harlan County in mid-April, he found more disturbing news awaiting him. During his absence, 3 more people had disappeared. They were not members of the Callahan family, but individuals who had been on the property after the disappearance. One of the men who had assisted in the initial search never returned home one night. His wife searched for days, but he had vanished as completely as the Callahans. 2 weeks later, a woman who had taken some clothing from the Callahan home, thinking no one else would need it, also disappeared without a trace. Panic began to spread through the community. People avoided speaking of the Callahans and even passing near the abandoned property. Some whispered that the land itself was cursed, that anyone who set foot on it or touched anything belonging to the family would be the next to vanish. Sheriff Hadley made a decision. He could not solve this case through traditional means because it was not a traditional case. He wrote an extremely vague official report, stating that the Callahan family had apparently left the area for unknown reasons, and that despite extensive efforts, no trace of them had been found. He mentioned the dress found in the ravine and the diary, but completely omitted his trip to Virginia and everything he had learned about the Blackwoods. However, Hadley kept a personal diary separate from the official records. In this diary, discovered over 100 years later, he recorded every disturbing detail, every strange encounter, every moment of terror he had experienced in the Virginia mountains. He wrote of his own doubts, of how an educated, rational man could begin to believe things that defied all logic. In May of 1843, the sheriff ordered the Callahan property burned. He cited concerns about structural safety and the risk of accidental fire spreading through the forest as his official justification. But everyone knew the real reason. He was trying to cleanse the land, to erase any trace of the family swallowed by mystery. The cabin burned for an entire night. The flames were visible for miles, casting an eerie orange glow across the mountains. Witnesses claimed to hear strange sounds from the fire, almost like screaming voices, though upon closer approach, they realized it was merely the wind rustling through the trees and the crackling of burning wood. By morning, nothing remained but ash and blackened stone. The community hoped this would end the nightmare, that the disappearances would cease now that the last physical trace of the Callahans had been destroyed. For a time, it seemed to work. The disappearances stopped, and life in the mountains returned to its normal rhythm of isolation and hard work. But the case was never truly closed. 7 people had vanished without a satisfactory explanation. The deeds and documents from the fireplace were stored in the county archives, forgotten for decades. Martha's water-damaged diary was preserved as evidence, though no one could say precisely what it evidenced. Sheriff William Hadley served for another 12 years before retiring. He never again investigated disappearances in the remote mountain areas. Some said he had changed after that case, that something in him had broken, or perhaps awakened. He drank more, spoke less, and could often be seen staring at the mountains to the east with an expression of barely concealed terror. Years passed, and the story of the Callahan family slowly became a local legend. Older generations told younger ones about that terrible winter of 1842, always in hushed tones, always with a nervous glance at the shadows. But as with all stories passed down orally, details were lost, others were added, and the truth was buried beneath layers of speculation and fear. In the 1850s, the area began to develop further. New families arrived, roads were improved, and the Cumberland Gap settlement grew considerably. The old Callahan property, now just a scorched patch of land overgrown with new vegetation, was eventually sold at public auction for unpaid taxes. A farmer named Augustus Webb bought it for a pittance, ignoring the warnings of older residents. Augustus built a new house on the same site as the Callahan cabin. He was a pragmatic man from the East who did not believe in ghost stories or curses. For the first few months, everything seemed normal. He farmed the land, raised livestock, and planned to expand his property. His wife, Catherine, was pregnant with their first child, and they saw the place as the beginning of a prosperous new life. But in the fall of 1854, strange things began to happen. Augustus would wake in the middle of the night to footsteps outside, but no one was there upon investigation. Catherine swore she saw shadows moving in the corners of rooms, figures that vanished when she looked directly. The animals grew restless, with horses refusing to approach certain areas of the property. In November of that year, exactly 12 years after the Callahans disappeared, Catherine gave birth. The labor was difficult, and the child was born prematurely, a boy, but with something deeply wrong. The attending midwife was so distraught, she refused to return to the house. She would not say exactly what she saw, but muttered about strange markings on the baby's skin, symbols that should not be there. The infant lived only 3 days. Augustus and Catherine buried him in a small makeshift cemetery at the back of the property. 2 weeks later, Catherine began having night terrors, screaming that there were children at the windows, 5 pale-faced children watching her, tapping on the glass with small hands. Augustus never saw anything when he checked, but Catherine became so convinced she refused to sleep in any room with windows facing the forest. In early December, Augustus decided to leave the estate. He had invested everything in the land, but it was not worth it. Catherine was on the verge of madness, and he himself was beginning to see inexplicable things. The feeling of being constantly watched was unbearable. They left on a cold morning, taking only what they could carry, and never returned. The house was abandoned once more. No one else tried to buy the land. It remained empty, slowly reclaimed by the forest. Over the decades, trees grew around and through the ruins of Augustus's house, creating a skeletal structure covered in vines and moss. During the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865, the Kentucky Mountains became contested territory. Both Union and Confederate troops passed through the region. Military records note a disturbing incident in the fall of 1863. A detachment of 23 Union soldiers camped near what had been the Callahan estate, unaware of its history. They were weary men seeking rest. On the first night, 2 sentries disappeared from their posts. Initially thought to have deserted, it was strange they took no equipment. On the second night, 3 more soldiers vanished. The detachment commander, Captain James Morrison, ordered everyone to stay together and keep campfires burning all night. Soldiers reported hearing sounds from the surrounding forest, as if a large group moved through the trees, but torches revealed only impenetrable darkness. On the third night, the entire detachment fled in panic. Official Union records described the incident as a surprise attack by Confederate guerrillas, but Captain Morrison's personal diary, discovered decades later, tells a different story. He wrote of pale figures emerging from the woods, of absolute terror gripping his men, of seeing things that defied rational explanation. Of the original 23 soldiers, only 16 escaped the area. The other 7 simply disappeared, and their bodies were never found. After the war, during Reconstruction, there were attempts to further develop the Appalachian region. Lumber companies began operating in the mountains, cutting down old-growth oak and chestnut forests, but workers consistently avoided the area where the former Callahan property stood. There was something about that place that made even the bravest men refuse to work there. The trees in that specific area remained untouched, forming an island of ancient forest amidst the surrounding deforestation. In the late 19th century, a folklore scholar named Edmund Blackthorne traveled through the Appalachians collecting local stories and legends. He spent weeks in Harlan County in 1896, interviewing elderly residents. He was the first to systematically document the Callahan history, compiling testimonies, reviewing old county records, and even attempting to locate Sheriff Hadley's personal diary, which had not yet been discovered. Blackthorne was fascinated by the case. He also traveled to Virginia, retracing the same steps Hadley had taken 53 years earlier. Yet when he tried to locate the Blackwoods or the stone cabin in the mountains, he found nothing. The trail Nathaniel Cross had described simply no longer existed, or perhaps it never had. The Blackwater settlement was still there, smaller and more decayed, but the few remaining inhabitants refused to discuss the Blackwoods. Some even denied such a family had ever existed. Frustrated but intrigued, Blackthorne published a short book in 1898 titled Dark Mysteries of the Appalachians. The chapter on the Callahan family was the longest, and he made no attempt to provide rational explanations. Instead, he presented the facts as he had uncovered them, leaving it to the reader to decide what to believe. The book had limited circulation and eventually faded into obscurity, though a few copies survive in university libraries and private collections. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to Appalachia. Better roads were constructed, electricity reached even the most remote settlements, and the region's defining isolation began to wane. Yet despite all modernization, the old Callahan property remained untouched, a piece of land that progress seemed to deliberately avoid. In 1923, 81 years after the original disappearance, a young historian named Robert Thatcher decided to investigate the case for his doctoral dissertation at the University of Kentucky. Thatcher had access to resources Edmund Blackthorne never did, including better organized government records and easier travel between states. He spent 2 years immersed in research, and what he discovered was both fascinating and profoundly disturbing. Thatcher managed to trace the entire Whitmore family lineage from Jonathan to Thomas Callahan. He uncovered a shocking pattern. Each generation of the family had experienced inexplicable tragedies. Jonathan's son, Edward Whitmore, had disappeared in 1836, along with his wife, leaving only young Thomas as an orphan at age 10. Thomas had been raised by distant uncles who did not bear the Whitmore name, which likely explains his survival into adulthood. More disturbing were Thatcher's findings about other members of the extended family. Cousins, nephews, anyone with Whitmore. Blood seemed marked by mysterious disappearances or unexplained deaths. In 1857, 3 of Thomas's second cousins vanished while traveling through Tennessee. In 1872, a distant cousin died under bizarre circumstances in Ohio, her body discovered in a forest, with an expression of absolute terror frozen on her face, yet no visible injuries. The pattern continued into Thatcher's own time. He discovered there were still living descendants of the Whitmore family, people unaware of their connection to Jonathan and the stolen land in Virginia. Most had changed their names over generations, just as Thomas had done by adopting the surname Callahan, but the bloodline remained. Thatcher attempted to contact some of these descendants for interviews. 3 agreed to speak. All reported strange experiences throughout their lives, recurring nightmares of dark forests and shadowy figures, unexplained feelings of being followed, periods of extreme misfortune with no rational cause. 1, a 42-year-old man named William Patterson, said something that made Thatcher question whether to continue his research. "There's something wrong with our family. There always has been. It's as if something has been hunting us, generation after generation, waiting for the right moment." Armed with this information, Thatcher decided to do what no one had done in decades: visit the old Callahan estate in person. It was the summer of 1925 when he finally made the journey. The area was even more isolated than he had anticipated. No modern roads came close, and he had to hike the last 5 miles along ancient, nearly invisible trails. When he reached the spot, he was struck by how completely nature had reclaimed the land. The ruins of Augustus Webb's house were faintly visible, but covered by decades of vegetation. Trees grew through what had been rooms, their roots breaking through the stone foundations. The area possessed a silence Thatcher had never experienced before. No birdsong, no sounds of small animals in the undergrowth, just absolute stillness. Thatcher began meticulously exploring, taking notes and photographs with his heavy plate camera. He located what he believed to be the original fireplace of the Callahan cabin, now just scattered blackened stones. He dug carefully around them, hoping to find artifacts that might have survived the 1843 fire. It was then that he found the bones. They were buried about 2 feet deep, carefully arranged in a manner suggesting deliberate burial rather than casual disposal. Thatcher was no anthropologist, but he recognized they were human bones and not from a single individual. The varying sizes suggested multiple people of different ages. With shaking hands, Thatcher dug more carefully. He found 7 skulls in total, 5 small, 1 medium, 1 large, an entire family. Alongside the bones were fragments of tissue, preserved by some peculiar chemistry in the soil. And there was something else. Marks on the bones. Not signs of violence or trauma, but engraved symbols, as if intricate patterns had been carefully carved into each bone after death. Thatcher knew he had made an extraordinary discovery. These were almost certainly the remains of the Callahan family. But how had they gotten there? Who had buried them? And why had no one found them during all the searches 83 years earlier? He decided he needed professional help. He carefully marked the exact location, covered the bones again to protect them, and began the journey back to organize a proper excavation with forensic anthropologists and archaeologists. But Thatcher never organized that excavation. 3 days after leaving the property, he began having the same nightmares the Whitmore descendants had described: figures in the shadows, whispers in unrecognizable languages, a constant feeling of being watched. He tried to dismiss it as stress and the psychological toll of spending time in that place steeped in dark history. A week later, Thatcher was driving on a main road near Lexington when his car veered off the road for no apparent reason. The accident investigation concluded he had lost control, possibly due to fatigue. Yet witnesses reported something strange. Moments before the accident, they saw figures in the road ahead of Thatcher, causing him to swerve sharply. But when others arrived at the scene, there wasn't one on the road except Thatcher and his wrecked car. Robert Thatcher survived, but was seriously injured, spending 3 months in the hospital recovering from multiple fractures and head trauma. Upon his release, he was a changed man. He completely abandoned his research on the Callahan family. All his notes, photographs, and documents were sealed in a box with instructions never to open it. He changed his field of study entirely, spending the rest of his academic career on safe, mundane topics, like Kentucky economic history, far removed from unexplained mysteries or cursed families. Thatcher's notes remained sealed until his death in 1968. His heirs, unaware of the history behind the box, eventually donated it to the University of Kentucky archives, where it was cataloged but not examined in detail for decades. Years passed, and the Callahan family story remained dormant in the dusty archives of libraries and universities. World War II came and went, bringing its own tragedies and mysteries that overshadowed older cases of disappearances in the mountains. America changed dramatically during the 1950s and 1960s. Technology, communication, and transportation transformed even the most remote regions of Appalachia, yet the former Callahan property remained untouched, an anomaly amidst development. Occasional attempts to clear the area for logging always failed in peculiar ways. Equipment broke down inexplicably. Workers fell ill or refused to continue. Eventually, companies simply gave up, leaving that particular patch of forest as an unintended sanctuary. In 1974, a group of college students interested in paranormal phenomena decided to camp on the old property for a weekend in October. They were 5 young men from the University of Kentucky, armed with cameras, audio recorders, and youthful enthusiasm. They had read about the Callahan case in an obscure library reference and thought it would be a thrilling adventure to investigate a possibly haunted location. The group arrived on a Friday afternoon, set up camp in the ruins of the old house, and prepared their equipment for a night of observation. The first strange sounds began shortly after dusk, whispers from the surrounding forest, so faint it was hard to tell if they were real or imagined. One student, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, insisted she saw figures moving among the trees, always at the edge of her vision. Around midnight, the audio recorders began picking up sounds inaudible to the human ear, but clear on playback, multiple voices speaking simultaneously in a cacophony of whispers. The words were not entirely intelligible, but fragments could be discerned. Go back. It doesn't belong. The debt. We don't want them. At 2 a.m, panic gripped the group. All 5 swore they saw the same thing. Children emerging from the forest. 5 small children in old, torn clothing, their pale faces glowing faintly in the darkness. The children did not move normally, seeming to glide along the ground, their eyes completely black with no visible whites. The students fled in absolute panic, leaving all their equipment behind. They ran down dark trails, tripping over roots and rocks, until they reached the road and their cars. They drove non-stop to Lexington, shaking and in shock. They initially planned to report the incident to the police, but decided against it, realizing how ridiculous it would sound. 2 days later, one of the students, a young man named Michael Torres, returned during the day with 2 friends to retrieve the abandoned equipment. When they reached the campsite, they found something impossible. All the equipment was carefully arranged in an orderly pile in the center of the ruins. The cameras were open, their film completely exposed to light and rendered useless. The audio recorders were disassembled, their magnetic tapes unwound and spread in circular patterns around the pile. Michael never spoke about that night again to anyone outside the original group. The 5 students made a silent pact never to return to that place or speak publicly about their experience. But Jennifer Walsh kept a private journal documenting everything, including the recurring nightmares that haunted her for years afterward, a diary that would only be discovered decades later, adding another layer to the growing mystery. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Harlan County region experienced severe economic decline as the coal industry collapsed. Many families left, and entire villages became ghost towns. The old Callahan property, already isolated, became even more remote as the few roads leading to it were neglected and swallowed by vegetation. It was during this period of decline that stories about the property resurfaced with renewed intensity. Hunters venturing into the mountains reported strange experiences in the area, compasses spinning wildly, hunting dogs refusing to go beyond a certain point, oppressive sensations of being watched by multiple invisible eyes. Some swore they saw pale lights moving through the forest at night, similar to the lights Jacob Reeves had reported in 1842. In 1996, exactly 154 years after the original disappearance, a documentary filmmaker named David Brennan decided to make a film about the Callahan case. He had become interested after reading a brief mention in a book about Appalachian legends. David was a skeptic by nature, not believing in ghosts or curses, and saw the project as an opportunity to explore how urban legends develop and persist over time. David spent 6 months meticulously researching before filming began. He found Robert Thatcher's sealed box in the university archives, and, unaware of the full story, decided to open it. Inside were all of Thatcher's notes, including photographs of the former estate, detailed maps, and, most importantly, the exact location where he had found the buried bones. Excited by the discovery, David planned an expedition to the property with a small crew, a cameraman, a sound technician, and a local guide familiar with the mountains. They set off on a clear September morning, carrying modern filming equipment and GPS to ensure they wouldn't get lost. The journey was more difficult than anticipated. The old trails had completely disappeared, replaced by dense vegetation. The local guide, a man in his 60s named Earl Dawson, grew increasingly nervous as they approached their destination, muttering about how the area had always had a bad reputation, how his grandfather had told him never to go there, how animals avoided that particular patch of forest. When they finally reached the ruins, it was mid-afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to constantly shift. David immediately began filming, documenting the ruins and the surrounding forest, and making narrative notes about the site's history. Using Thatcher's coordinates, they located the area where the bones had supposedly been found. David decided they would do a small exploratory dig, just enough to check if anything was still there. He didn't plan to disturb any remains they might find, only to document their existence and then notify the appropriate authorities. They dug carefully for about an hour. Approximately 15 inches down, their shovels struck something solid. Using their hands, they carefully cleared away the surrounding soil and uncovered bones. Yet something was profoundly wrong. The bones had not decomposed naturally. They possessed a strange, almost black coloration, and were covered in markings that were clearly unnatural. These were complex symbols etched deep into the bone, forming intricate patterns that seemed meaningful but were indecipherable to anyone in the group. David Brennan meticulously filmed everything, capturing close-ups of the marked bones, their abnormal color, and the carved symbols. His initial excitement had shifted into something more complex, a mixture of academic fascination and a growing sense of unease. The sound technician, a man named Marcus Reed, repeatedly reported strange interference in his equipment. There was a constant, low-frequency hum that had no place in such a remote forest, and occasionally his recorder picked up what sounded like whispering voices, even though no one else was around besides the 4 crew members. Earl Dawson, the local guide, was visibly agitated. He begged them to stop digging, to leave the bones where they were, and to depart immediately. There was a genuine, unfeigned terror in his voice that even gave the skeptical David pause. But curiosity prevailed, and David decided to dig a little deeper, just to see how many bones were buried there. That is when they found something that should not have been present. Among the ancient bones, partially buried in the dark soil, was a modern object. It was a metal brooch, rusted, but still recognizable. The cameraman, James Park, carefully picked it up and cleaned it. On the back was an inscription: Jennifer Walsh, class of 1976. An absolute silence fell over the group. That brooch could not be there. Jennifer had visited the site in 1974, 22 years earlier. How had her brooch ended up buried with bones, supposedly dating back to 1842? Unless someone had excavated the bones, buried the brooch with them, and then covered everything up again. But why? And when? David was trying to formulate a rational explanation when Earl shouted. He was pointing at the surrounding forest, his face completely pale. Everyone turned to look. Among the trees, partially obscured by shadows, were figures, multiple figures, standing completely still, just watching. It was difficult to determine how many there were. The filtered light and shifting shadows made an accurate count impossible, but there were many, perhaps dozens. James immediately began filming the figures, but when he looked through the camera's viewfinder, he saw nothing. He pulled the camera away, looked with his own eyes, and the figures were still there. He looked through the camera again, and there were only trees and shadows. Marcus checked his sound equipment and noticed the levels were completely erratic, registering sounds akin to a jet engine, even though everything seemed silent to his ears. Earl did not wait any longer. He simply started running. abandoning the group and disappearing into the woods toward the trail they had taken. His panic was contagious. David yelled for everyone to pack up their gear immediately. They did not try to cover the bones again. They just dropped everything and began following Earl as fast as they could. The flight through the forest was chaotic and terrifying. The figures seemed to be everywhere now, always at the edge of vision, always silent, always watching. Marcus swore he saw children among the figures, children with pale faces and antiquated clothing, exactly as the college students had described 22 years earlier. James stumbled and fell, dropping his expensive camera, which tumbled down the slope. He did not even try to retrieve it. He just got up and kept running. It took them nearly 3 hours to find their way back to their vehicles, even though the outward journey had taken less than 2. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself around them. The trails they had carefully marked were simply no longer where they should have been. When they finally emerged onto the road where they had left their trucks, Earl was already there, sitting on the ground beside his vehicle, shaking uncontrollably. No one spoke during the entire journey back, as if words were inadequate to process what they had experienced. Upon reaching the nearest village, David made a decision. He told the others he was canceling the documentary. Everything they had filmed would be destroyed. No one would ever know about that expedition. However, James had saved the main camera's memory cards before they began digging, tucking them into his pocket as a routine precaution to ensure they would not lose the day's work. These cards contained everything they had filmed before discovering the bones. Days later, when he was alone, James reviewed the footage. What he saw made him question his own sanity. At multiple points during filming, when the camera was focused on David speaking or on the ruins, figures were visible in the background, at the edge of the frame. Figures that definitely had not been there during the actual filming. They appeared for only a few frames, sometimes just one, before disappearing. And when James paused on these specific frames and zoomed in, he could see faces. Children's faces, adults' faces, all bearing expressions of inexpressible suffering. James made copies of the memory cards and stored them in a safe. He never showed the footage to anyone, but he also could not bring himself to destroy it. It represented evidence of something extraordinary, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. He spent the next few years obsessed with the Callahan case, collecting every scrap of information he could find and assembling a vast private archive. It was James who eventually located Jennifer Walsh in 2003. She was living in Canada, having moved from the United States decades earlier. When he contacted her and mentioned the brooch, Jennifer panicked. She said she had lost the brooch during the night they camped on the property in 1974, assuming it had fallen somewhere during their desperate escape. The thought that it had been found, buried with the ancient bones, made her physically ill. Jennifer then revealed something she had never told anyone, not even the other students from that night. She had experienced a recurring dream ever since, hundreds of times over nearly 30 years. In the dream, she was back in those woods, but it was night and bonfires were burning. People dressed in ancient clothing were performing some kind of ceremony around the bones. And among these people, she recognized faces. Sheriff Hadley was there, and Robert Thatcher, and people she had never met in real life, but whose faces she recognized from old photographs connected to the Callahan case. In the dream, all these people turned to look at her simultaneously, and their eyes were completely black. Then they said in unison, "You touched what you shouldn't have. Now, you're part of it." Jennifer always woke from this dream in a panic, covered in a cold sweat, and it took hours for her to calm down enough to go back to sleep. James shared his own discoveries with Jennifer, including the figures in the footage. They spent hours on the phone comparing experiences, trying to make sense of the impossible. Eventually, they arrived at a disturbing conclusion. Whatever had happened to the Callahan family in 1842 was not over. It was still happening in some way that defied a linear understanding of time. The property was not simply haunted in the traditional sense. It was something far more complex, as if that particular piece of land existed in multiple temporalities simultaneously. Jennifer mentioned something else before ending the conversation. She said that ever since that night in 1974, she had been tracking news reports of unexplained disappearances in the Appalachian region. There was a pattern. Every 7 years or so, someone would disappear in the mountains near the old Callahan property. Sometimes they were hunters, sometimes hikers, and once it was a geologist conducting research. No bodies were ever found. The searches always turned up nothing, and there were always witness reports of strange lights or figures seen in the woods shortly before the disappearances. Jennifer Walsh's revelation about the pattern of disappearances every 7 years opened a new dimension to the mystery. James Park spent the following months meticulously reviewing missing person records in Harlan County and surrounding areas dating back to 1842. The work was exhaustive, requiring him to visit dozens of libraries, records offices, and historical archives across 3 states. What he discovered confirmed Jennifer's pattern, but also revealed something even more disturbing. The disappearances were not completely random. Every person who disappeared had some connection, however tenuous, to the Whitmore family or the former Callahan estate. Sometimes it was a distant genealogical link, discovered only through obscure 19th-century marriage and baptism records. Other times, it was a physical connection. People who had visited the estate, touched artifacts recovered from it, or even simply studied the case in academic depth. Robert Thatcher, for example, never disappeared, but his car accident occurred exactly 7 years after his visit to the estate. The 5 college students from 1974, though not physically gone, all experienced significant traumatic events in their lives within 7 years of that night. One of them died in an unexplained house fire 7 years later. Another developed sudden and severe schizophrenia exactly 14 years after the visit. The pattern was there, consistent and relentless, like a cosmic clock ticking in a way that defied coincidence. In 2008, 66 years after Thatcher's discovery, and 34 years after the student's visit, something extraordinary happened. The United States Forest Service announced plans to build a new recreational trail that would pass near the former Callahan property. The proposal included clearing vegetation, installing informational signs, and even building a small shelter for hikers, part of a larger initiative to revitalize tourism in the Appalachians. James Park, now completely obsessed with the case, saw this as a potential catastrophe. He began a campaign to block the project, contacting environmental groups, local historians, and anyone else with influence. He wrote letters to newspapers and created a website dedicated to preserving the area as a nature sanctuary. But he could not state the real reason for his opposition without sounding completely insane. Construction began in June 2008. A team of 12 workers was assigned to begin clearing vegetation and marking the trail. For the first 3 days, everything seemed normal. But on the morning of the 4th day, 2 of the workers simply did not show up. Their colleagues assumed they had quit, something not uncommon on difficult forestry projects. However, when the supervisor tried to contact them by phone, he discovered they had both left their homes during the night, taking nothing but the clothes they were wearing. A week later, another worker disappeared. This time, there were witnesses. He was working with a chainsaw, felling smaller trees, when he simply dropped the equipment and walked into the forest. His colleagues called out to him, but he did not respond. He just kept walking, as if in a trance. They tried to follow him, but somehow lost sight of him, even though he was only a few meters away. Extensive searches revealed no trace of him. The project was suspended indefinitely. The supervisor, a pragmatic man named Gerald Stone, admitted in an official report that something was deeply wrong with that particular area of the forest. He mentioned equipment, failing for no reason, compasses spinning wildly, and an oppressive feeling that made even the most experienced workers deeply uncomfortable. The report was shelved. The project was officially canceled for budgetary reasons, and no one spoke publicly about it again. But Gerald Stone could not simply forget. He began his own investigation, uncovered the Callahan story, and eventually contacted James Park. The two formed an unlikely partnership, the skeptical forestry supervisor and the obsessed cameraman, both united by the certainty that something terrible and inexplicable was happening in those mountains. In 2010, they decided to make one last expedition to the property, this time with much more careful preparation. They recruited a small but specialized team, a forensic anthropologist, a historian specializing in Appalachian cultures, and a technologist with advanced environmental monitoring equipment. They brought high-definition cameras with night vision, sensitive audio recorders, and even electromagnetic field meters, though none truly knew what they expected to find with such instruments. The expedition was meticulously planned to last only a single day. From 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, just enough time to arrive, document what they could, and leave well before nightfall. Everyone had agreed they would not remain on the property after dark under any circumstances. They arrived without incident, and initially, everything appeared peaceful. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so, with occasional bird song and the gentle rustle of leaves in a soft breeze. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, quickly located the previous excavation site using GPS. They began a new, careful, and methodical dig, this time documenting everything with scientific precision. The bones were still there, exactly where they had been left years before. Dr. Chen made detailed observations, collected samples for carbon dating, and photographed the engraved symbols from every conceivable angle. She confirmed the bones were definitely human, belonging to 7 different individuals, ranging in age from approximately 4 to 40 years. The preservation was unusual for remains over a century and a half old, and the symbols were utterly baffling, corresponding to no known writing system or documented cultural tradition. They were unique, and the precision of their engraving suggested advanced anatomical knowledge and a deliberate purpose. The historian, Professor Marcus Whitfield, recognized some elements within the symbols. He noted they appeared to be a disturbing fusion of ancient Celtic markings, Native American symbols specific to the Appalachian region, and something else entirely unidentifiable. It was as if multiple esoteric traditions had been merged into something new and sinister. As they worked, the technologist, Kevin Liu, monitored his instruments. The electromagnetic field meters showed strange, inexplicable fluctuations. Spikes of activity with no identifiable source. The temperature within the excavation area was consistently 4 degrees cooler than the surrounding forest, and sensitive recorders picked up low-frequency sounds below the threshold of normal human hearing. When Kevin processed these sounds through software to make them audible, they resembled chanting multiple voices reciting something rhythmic in an unknown language. Around 3 in the afternoon, the situation began to deteriorate. Cameras began failing simultaneously, their fully charged batteries draining in minutes. Cell phones stopped working entirely, even those that previously had a weak signal. And then they began to see the figures, not peripherally this time, but directly ahead among the trees. Figures dressed in period clothing, some from the 19th century, others seemingly much older. The figures did not approach, but they did not disappear either. They remained there, motionless among the trees, watching with an intensity that could be physically felt. Dr. Sarah Chen, despite her scientific training and decades of forensic work, felt something she had never experienced before. An absolute primal terror, the kind of fear etched into human DNA through millions of years of evolution. Gerald Stone made the decision. It was time to leave, immediately. They began packing their equipment with trembling hands, trying to maintain a semblance of professional calm. But everyone felt it. The forest had changed. It was no longer just a physical place. It felt alive and conscious, and they were profoundly unwelcome. The figures began to multiply, dozens turning into hundreds, forming a circle that slowly closed around the clearing where they worked. It was then that Kevin Liu noticed something on his meters that stopped him in his tracks. The electromagnetic radiation levels had skyrocketed to impossible readings, and the temperature was plummeting rapidly, dropping 5 degrees every minute. He looked at the others, his voice trembling, and said, "This isn't physically possible. Whatever's happening here is violating fundamental laws of physics." Professor Whitfield, taking a last look at the symbols on the bones before they left, had a sudden revelation. He finally recognized what he had failed to identify before. The symbols were not merely markings. They were a form of imprisonment, an attempt to bind something or someone to that specific place. And by repeatedly excavating the bones over the decades, by studying and photographing them, visitors had inadvertently weakened that imprisonment. Their escape was chaotic, yet strangely organized. The figures did not attack them, but seemed to guide them, herding them toward a specific path through the forest. James Park realized they were being deliberately driven, like cattle into a corral. He shouted at the others to change direction, to cut through the dense vegetation instead of following the open trails the figures seemed to want them to take. This decision likely saved their lives. They fought through thorny bushes and dense vines, tearing at their clothing and skin, but eventually emerged into an area that felt less oppressive. The figures did not follow them beyond a certain point, as if restrained by an invisible boundary. The team kept running until they reached their vehicles, and no one looked back until they were miles away. That night, gathered in a cheap motel in the nearest town, they tried to make sense of their experience. Dr. Chen had the bone samples she had collected carefully stored in sterile containers. Kevin had some surviving recordings from before the equipment failed. Professor Whitfield had photographs of the symbols. They possessed tangible evidence of something extraordinary, yet profoundly dangerous. They made a collective decision. The bone samples would be sent to a laboratory for dating and analysis, but anonymously, with no mention of their origin. The recordings and photographs would be archived but never published. They would never speak publicly about what truly happened that day. The truth was simply too immense, too strange, and potentially too dangerous to share openly. The carbon dating results returned 3 months later, and they were impossible. The bones dated from wildly different periods, some from the mid-19th century, but others were far older, some over 300 years. Yet they had been buried together, carefully arranged like a family. It was as if time itself were distorted in that place, with different layers of history existing simultaneously. James Park spent the next several years compiling everything he knew about the Callahan case into a massive manuscript he never intended to publish. For his own understanding, it was an attempt to organize decades of fragmented information into something coherent. He documented every disappearance, every visit to the property, every strange event connected to that cursed land. The pattern was undeniable. Every 7 years, the land claimed its toll, and nothing anyone did seemed capable of breaking the cycle. In 2015, James received an unexpected letter from an elderly woman living in a nursing home in North Carolina. She had read a brief mention of the Callahan case in an obscure mystery magazine, and the name had stirred old memories. She identified herself as a descendant of the Blackwood family, the same family that had cursed Jonathan Whitmore nearly 2 centuries earlier. The woman, Eleanor Blackwood, was 93 years old. She wrote that her family had kept records of everything, passed down through generations. Stories of the stolen land, and the vengeance that was sworn. She explained that when the Blackwoods cursed the Whitmores, they did not merely condemn a family, they tied the debt to the land itself, creating a link between the physical plane and something much older and darker. The land had become a portal, a point of intersection between worlds, and the Callahan spirits were trapped there, serving as eternal guardians of a passage that was never meant to be opened. Eleanor wrote that her family had tried over the years to undo what had been done. But curses of that kind, rooted in deep pain and intertwining multiple ancient traditions, could not simply be undone. They took on a life of their own, becoming entities separate from their creators. The only way to break them would be through true reconciliation, genuine forgiveness on both sides, and the restitution of the stolen land to its original guardians. But how can one forgive when all the original parties have been dead for over a century? How can one restore land that no longer belongs to anyone? Eleanor died 3 weeks after sending that letter. James traveled to her funeral, where he met the few remaining members of the Blackwood family. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives, carrying the weight of a history they barely understood. They confirmed Eleanor's words, showing James old family records written in faded notebooks, diaries dating back to 1823 that documented exactly how the curse had been cast. The described rituals were complex and disturbing, involving blood, bone, and earth, with words and languages that blended ancient Gaelic with lost native dialects. The Blackwoods of 1823 were not simply seeking revenge. They were trying to protect something sacred, a place of power that had been respected for countless generations before colonists arrived. Jonathan Whitmore had desecrated this place, built upon it, and claimed ownership of something that could never be possessed. James finally understood. The Callahan family had not been killed in the traditional sense. They had been pulled through the veil, transformed into guardians, trapped between worlds to protect the gateway that should never have been opened. Every person who had disappeared since then was being added to the guardians, strengthening the seal that kept something terrible contained. It was a horrifying, yet necessary fate. Today, in 2025, the former Callahan property remains untouched. Official maps show the area, but hiking trails carefully circumvent it. The Forest Service maintains the region as a wildlife sanctuary, though few animals actually inhabit it. Warning signs have been installed nearby, citing dangerous terrain and landslide risks, but the true reason remains unspoken. James Park is still alive, now 78. He keeps his extensive case file, updated regularly with any new information. The 7-year pattern continues. The last disappearance occurred in 2022, a nature photographer who ignored all warnings and camped near the ruins for 3 nights. His camera was found, its memory cards intact. The photographs showed something impossible. The Callahan cabin standing again, whole and solid, with lamplight shining through the windows and figures moving inside, living their lives as if it were still 1842. We may never fully understand what transpired on that property in the Kentucky mountains nearly 200 years ago. We may never know exactly where the Callahan family is, or if they still experience something we might call consciousness. But the land remembers. The forest holds its secrets. And on silent nights when the wind blows through the Appalachian valleys, they say you can still hear children laughing or perhaps crying. Echoes of a family forever trapped between worlds, repaying a debt that was never truly theirs to begin with. If you are ever traveling through the mountains of eastern Kentucky and encounter a place where the forest suddenly grows darker, where birds do not sing, and the air seems thicker, perhaps it is best to move on. Some stories do not have happy endings. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some debts, once etched into the very fabric of reality, continue to be collected generation after generation, eternally. If this story touched you, if you felt the chills run down your spine, as we did, while uncovering each new layer of this dark tale, please like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments if you have had any unexplained experiences in the mountains, or if you know of other stories buried by time. Sometimes, keeping these stories alive is the only way to honor those lost in the shadows. Until the next journey through history's most disturbing mysteries,